this afternoon, indeed almost this evening, for this magnificent lunch. And thank you very much indeed, Salvatore, for having organised this. Your conference has obviously been a tremendous success, and so it's a great honour for me to wind it up with this lovely lunch. It could not be in more glorious circumstances, and thank you. What brings us here, of course, is the 150th birthday of Sir Winston Churchill. A tremendous moment when you think about it, that after 150 years, an entire century and a half, he is still an important enough figure for all of these distinguished people around this table to want to come together and celebrate him. I think there's something very important, something serious is going on here today. And I'd like to just start by talking about Churchill's love of Italy. He was 19 years old, of course, when he came here for the first time in 1893. He was just a young man from Sandhurst, about to go up to Sandhurst, and he wrote to his mother, Jenny Jerome, about Lake Maggiore, how beautiful Lake Maggiore was, and how beautiful the Italian women were as well, which we hardly need to be reminded of around this table. In 1897, he came back on his way back from India, and on that occasion, he had a fortnight here. He went to Pompeii and Rome, and he wrote this to his mother. I read again the sentences in which Gibbon has described the emotions with which in his later years for the first time he approached the Eternal City. And though I have none of his credentials of learning, it was not without reverence that I followed in his footsteps. And so that sent me back, reading that, sent me back to that particular paragraph in the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which Gibbon actually spoke about those words. And I think that it's such a Churchillian prose apart from anything else, that it's worth remembering, repeating that fabulous paragraph where Gibbon in 1776 writes, "It was at Rome on the 15th of October 1764, as I sat musing amidst the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted friars were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and fall of the city first started to my mind. At a distance of 25 years, I can neither forget nor express the strong emotions which agitated my mind as I first approached and entered the Eternal City. After a sleepless night, I trod, with a lofty step, the ruins of the Forum. Each memorable spot where Romulus stood, or Tully spoke, or Caesar fell, was at once present to my eye, and several days of intoxication were lost or enjoyed before I could descend to a cool and minute investigation." Isn't that the most magnificent paragraph? It explains it all. And of course, the reference to several days of intoxication also refers to my time here over the next few days. Then Churchill came back in 1927 as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He also was proud at the time, very proud, of the way in which Italy had fought in the First World War. The extraordinary, he called in World Crisis, he says that Italy was a first-class ally on our side. And he wrote, "The generous heart of the Italian nation proved not unequal to the long trials and disappointments of the struggle, nor unworthy to sustain amid its mocking fortunes the ancient fate of Rome." There were 12 battles. It's very important, I think, for Britons to recognise and remember that there were 12 battles of the Isonzo between the June of 1915 and the November of 1917, which cost no fewer than 688,000 Italian casualties by the end of the Battle of Caporetto. When we always think about Verdun, of course we do, but actually the Italians have their own Verdun. which explains so much also of what happened to the history of Italy in the 1920s and 1930s. And Winston Churchill did not blame the Italian people in any way for the decision of Mussolini in June 1940 to go to war against Britain. He made a statement in a broadcast to the Italian people on the 16th of May 1940, when he said, "Down the ages and above all other calls comes the cry that the joint heirs of Latin and Christian civilization must not be ranged against one another in mortal strife." And when Mussolini took that terrible decision, that monstrous decision that he did, on the 23rd of December 1940, Mussolini said, "One man has arrayed the trustees and inheritors of ancient Rome upon the site of the ferocious pagan barbarians. There lies the tragedy of Italian history, and there stands the criminal who has wrought the deed of folly and of shame." So he was particularly keen to make sure that the Italian people recognised that they were not being blamed for this. And another wonderful speech that he made on the 28th of September 1944, after a 16-day visit to Naples, Caserta, Capri, Cassino, Siena, Rome, and the front line at Loreto, which Nicoletta actually takes people to every year and knows a great deal about this. And it was after that, in his great speech of the 28th of September, that Churchill said, "What impressed and touched me most in my journey through Italy was the extraordinary goodwill to the British and American troops everywhere displayed by the Italian people. As I drove through the small towns and villages behind the line of the armies day after day, the friendliness and even enthusiasm of the peasants, workmen and shopkeepers, indeed of all classes, was spontaneous and convincing. I cannot feel, I make my confession, any sentiments of hostility towards the mass of the misled or coerced Italian people." Ladies and gentlemen, I look around this table, I don't see any peasants. I do see a few people from lowly professions. Richard is a lawyer, for example, and there are an awful lot of reformed politicians, and serving politicians, myself, lots of them. But overall, I think, recovering politicians, I think is probably the best way of putting it. But overall, when one looks at this great connection between Churchill and the Italians, I think that the International Churchill Society, which Salvatore and the rest of you are doing so much to build and to expand, is a really genuinely worthwhile thing, because it does remind people of this great friendship that Churchill spoke of between the Italian and the British peoples, which obviously must be extended. And much as I love the International Churchill Society, when I see on its website the words, "Churchill was upset when he learnt that Mussolini had been executed at the end of the war," I have to say that is complete rubbish. The actual thing that he genuinely said when he turned up to Chequers on the day that it happened was, and I quote, "The bloody beast is dead." So it's a very different thing from ICS. I might have to get on to Lee Pollock and get that, to try and get that changed at some stage. But it did mean, of course, that there was not going to be an Italian Nuremberg, which was very important. But the minute that the war was over, Churchill came here on the 1st of September. So whilst the Second World War was still going on in the East, he came here after the end of the war in Europe to paint at Lake Como with General Alexander. And there's a very moving moment where he makes friends with Captain Osier. He was only 25 years old, his aide-de-camp. And this captain had fought from Dunkirk to the Gothic line via Alamein. And they sat night after night talking about the great battles, including Omdurman and Alamein and so on. And there's a moment where he falls silent, and Captain Osier said, "What are you thinking, sir?" And Churchill said, "I'm hoping that I can command the moment to remain, i.e. that we could just stop time and I can enjoy myself here in Italy." And and Sarah, his daughter, wrote at exactly that time to Clementine Churchill, Churchill's wife. He is going to start a new picture today. I really think he is settling down. He said last night, "I've had a happy day. I haven't heard that for I don't know how long." So this was, and of course Churchill also came here in 1949 to Lake Garda and to Venice in 1951. He loved Italy because it had the capacity to make him happy. And that this was one of the places that he wanted to command the moment to remain. So why, ladies and gentlemen, are we here 150 years later? I think that if I can take you back to November 1874, 100 years ago, 150 years ago today, to a freezing cold. It seems very different than here in Rome, but a freezing cold November day in Oxfordshire, where Jenny Jerome, Churchill's mother, was walking out with the guns at Blenheim Palace and suffered a fall and then had a rickety drive back in a cart, and it brought on her labour pains 2 months prematurely, and she had and everything that they did to try to prevent the birth from taking place, they could, but her labour pains started. She had 8 hours in labour and appalling. There was no chloroform. They couldn't get the Oxford doctor. They couldn't get the London doctor in time. Instead, they got Frederick Taylor, the local Woodstock doctor, to whom I think we should all pay our thanks today. 150 years later, he did a wonderful job for the 25 guineas that Lord Randolph Churchill gave him. And it's very important to remember that actually it was a lifetime of extraordinarily close brushes with death. Actually, the day of his birth, 150 years ago today, was probably one of the closest brushes with death, being born in Victorian England 2 months prematurely. Then after that, you of course have the close brush of death when he's 10 years old and has pneumonia, and on that occasion the doctors administered brandy to the 10-year-old, both orally and rectally, which you would have thought would have put you off brandy for life, but certainly did not in Winston Churchill's case. He had a near drowning on Lake Geneva. He had 2 car crashes, 2 plane crashes, very nearly, of course, run over by a car on 5th Street and 5th Avenue and 76th Street in New York. He had a house fire, the number of, many others, a number of occasions that he nearly died. And those, by the way, of course, are only the peacetime close brushes with death. In wartime, he fought in 5 campaigns on 4 continents, and he took part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp in South Africa. He, in the First World War, had a German whiz-bang hit his dugout 5 minutes after he'd left it, decapitating everybody inside. And so you can totally understand why he said that he felt as if invisible wings were beating over him, because he had this, from all of these things, driving sense of personal destiny. And that's why I called my book Walking with Destiny, in reference obviously to the last paragraph of his great first volume of his war memoirs, The Gathering Storm, in which he spoke of the day that he became Prime Minister of Great Britain on the 10th of May 1940, coincidentally, not as a result of, coincidentally the same day that Adolf Hitler invaded Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg shortly afterwards, of course, France. He said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And it was a preparation, this extraordinary life that we're here today to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the beginning, was a preparation for the decisions that he was able to make because of all sorts of things, largely actually because of his mistakes. his huge number of mistakes that he made in his life, 5 or 6 really major ones, which today would probably topple any modern politician. But he learned from every single one of them. He was a politician who learned from his mistakes, which is an unusual and an extremely useful thing to be. Of course, all of this, his extraordinary foresight in seeing both the threat posed by Prussian and Wilhelmine militarism before the First World War, by the Nazis, and the fascists before the Second World War, and then, of course, after the Second World War, the equal threat posed by the monstrosity of Soviet communism, a creed which has killed 100 million people in the 20th century. To spot each of those 3 great threats to democracy and freedom showed the most Themistoclean foresight. And the way in which he was able to do that was, I think, down to 3 things. The first was that he was an historian. He had written again and again about all of these great threats to the balance of power in Europe. He spotted with the Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada the threat posed then. The attempts by Louis XIV of France at the time of the War of Spanish Succession, and the great threats that he posed, which of course his own great ancestor John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, was absolutely central in defeating. Then the threat posed by Napoleon, and of course he himself fought in the trenches against the threat posed by the Kaiser, and of course finally Adolf Hitler. So he saw the rise of the Nazis as part of a long continuum of British history, and the duty of Britain was to stop these hegemonistic attempts to dominate the continent. So he understood that. The second thing was that he appreciated what true fanaticism was like. He had seen the kind of thing before in the Nazis, and he'd seen it in the northwest frontier and in Sudan when he was fighting against the forerunner of Islamist fundamentalist terrorism and violence. This is something that had never been seen by the other 1930s premiers like Neville Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin and Ramsay MacDonald. These people hadn't come up close and personal to that kind of fanaticism in their lives. And Winston Churchill had, and so he was able to see it. And the third thing was his philo-Semitism. Winston Churchill liked Jews. He'd grown up with Jews, his father liked Jews, he admired their massive contribution to the concept of ethics. He was a supporter of the Balfour Declaration, he had close Jewish friends, and he was therefore very different from a lot of the upper class English people of the day in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, many of whom were anti-Semitic. You put those 3 things together, and you have a man who is willing to use as much moral courage as he had physical courage in not changing his stance when he came under attack in the 1930s. He was shouted down in the House of Commons. He was nearly deselected for his seat in the 1930s. He was ridiculed in the press. Under normal circumstances, a lot of people would have changed their minds. You know, the opinion polls were against him for month and year after year. He once said, actually, that he'd been told that it was very important for politicians to keep their ear to the ground with regard to opinion polls, but he didn't believe that the British people would respect a politician caught in so ungainly a posture. And that's the key thing to Winston Churchill. He showed leadership and expected others to follow him if they agreed with him, which for a very long time they didn't, until the 15th of March 1939 when Hitler took Prague. And he didn't have to go as the darkest hour, a film I love, by the way. Nonetheless, it implies that he was following public opinion by going down to the tube and asking what the people were saying on the tube trains. Ladies and gentlemen, the exact opposite is true. He showed the leadership, and people then followed him. And that is something, I think, that is a tremendously important and useful thing in politics. But all of this, none of this, would have been of any point whatsoever. The foresight, the capacity to learn from his mistakes, the moral and physical courage, none of it would have been of any use whatsoever if he hadn't had the oratory and the rhetoric and the power of language to force people to listen to him even if they didn't want to hear what he had to say. And that is very true of what happened in the 1930s. He had the capacity to essentially use such extraordinary, wonderful language that people had to listen to him. I once asked Anthony Montague Brown, his last private secretary, how it was that he did this. And Anthony had asked Churchill himself. And Churchill had said to him, well, there are three things. The first is that you should keep your sentences short. Don't just have long sentences with lots of sub-clauses and so on. Keep them short. The second thing is, don't use long words if short words will do, because don't try and sort of show off how clever you are using long words. Instead, concentrate on short ones. And the third thing is, try to use words that have been in existence for 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking people's words. And this you can see very well in the last 143 words of the greatest speech of his life, the 4th of June 1940, where he is in that last paragraph, where he's talking about what the British people are going to do, about fighting on the beaches and fighting on with ever greater confidence in the air, and fighting in the hills and the streets and so on, ending, of course, with that line, "We shall never surrender." And of that 143 words, all of them can be found, every single one of them can be found in the directory of the dictionary of Old English, except for two. The word confidence, which comes from the Latin, and the word surrender, which comes from the French. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, we have this young man, a Harrovian. Winston Churchill was almost entirely self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow. And he was at Harrow when he was 16 years old, and he said to his great friend Merland Evans that there will be enormous changes and struggles and battles in his life and in the world, in the life of the world, and that he was going to be instrumental in saving London and saving Britain, saving the Empire. And because of these things that I mentioned, and the reason that we're here today, 150 years later, is because of his moral courage, his physical courage, his ability to learn from his mistakes, his foresight, his oratory, and you put them all together, and Winston Churchill was not just able to save London and Britain, but also civilization itself. Thank you very much.
You need to